Hi, everyone, and welcome to Anti-Semitism on the Left and the Right. We're now streaming on Temple's Facebook page, so we've got a beautiful crowd. You can't see 50, 60 people in the room here. We've got another 50 or so, I believe, on the Zoom, and then we hope that many of you will join us on Facebook as we have this first conversation looking at our speaker that will be coming in May, Bari Weiss, looking at her book, and looking at, in particular, chapters 3 and 4 on anti-Semitism from the right and from the left. And if you enjoy this class, we're going to have a follow-up class with my great friend and a real scholar on this issue, Rabbi Josh Bennett. That will be on April 13th at 7 p.m. Today, we're going to talk about anti-Semitism as it is rising, both on the right and the left. And then that date, April 13th at 7, Rabbi Josh will talk about what we can do. And I think we all see that it's pressing that we do get involved. So there'll be lots of great ideas from her book and otherwise. And I do hope that you will also come and join us for the main event. This is, of course, a lead up to Bari Weiss's event here at Temple Israel. So let's get that information out. Bari Weiss will be coming to share a lecture on her book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, here at Temple Israel, Wednesday, May 3rd. The main event is going to be at 7:30, and that's $18 for members, $36 for non-members. Students are free. There's also an afterglow at 8:45. It's $90 a person, $36 for young adults. I think it's under 40 is the cutoff there. Of course, TI for Israel is supported, and we're grateful to the Miriam and Dr. Isaac Barr Israel Education Fund, and they're funding Bari Weiss coming in. It's an amazing, amazing event. And of course, in Michigan, we know Mitch Albom is coming. He's a favorite. We love him. So Mitch Albom has graciously agreed to come and have a conversation with Bari, which I think makes this event so incredibly exciting. We've had a few events in Temple for Israel, TI for Israel. One of them was Noah Tishby, thank you. Noah Tishby, and her book gave us incredible tools about how to deal with anti-Semitism and what the realities are. And we had many other speakers too coming in, classes, Israeli dignitaries. So if you've been following, I hope that you feel you have a number of tools and a perspective. And let me share some of the take-homes that I had. We may think from listening to the media and from what's going on in college campuses that somehow Israel is this thing plopped down in the middle of somebody else's country. In fact, we know Israel is our ancestral homeland. It's our reconstituted ancestral homeland. And we have a 3,000-year history there. We are the original inhabitants who lived there 4,000 years and had a continuous presence. So that is 100%. Whatever other claims there may be on the land now, we have at least an equal, and I would say a much greater claim. No one can say that we came out of nowhere and that that's not our homeland, period. As well, you hear often, and you might think that Israel is some kind of an apartheid state compared to South Africa and a horrible place. You know, if you visit there like me, you know that it is a thriving democracy. Whatever criticisms you may have of that democracy, every person in Israel proper has a vote, be they Jewish, Arab, or Christian. It's the only country you can say that about, really, in the Middle East as a functioning democracy. And in the last coalition, we actually had a Islamist party in the government, an Islamist party in the government that in many ways is working for ending Israel, as crazy as that seems. So I can't imagine a more thriving example of how Israel's democracy functions than that the coalition actually had an Arab party in it. Yet at the same time, during that time, no one paid much attention, and that apartheid crazy claim kept moving. So, you know, it needs to be at least clear for us that there are many, many differences between South African apartheid, where there was different situations, different rights, very deliberate separating of society, and Israel proper, which is an incredible thriving democracy, even under the stress of what they've gone through. And finally, I took home whatever issues with policy we may have with Israel, that if someone is calling for the dismantling and the destruction of only one state in the world, and there's 22 Arab and Muslim states, and there's one Jewish state, And there's countries in the world with insanely bad human rights records, and you're not calling for the dismantling of that country. That is anti-Semitism. I'm not saying any of us knows what the solution is to the tricky problem of what's happening and what's been happening. But one thing we should be clear is that people who are saying Israel needs to be dismantled, that they are anti-Zionists, they are against the existence of a Jewish state, one Jewish state in our ancestral homeland. I believe we need to be very clear that that's anti-Semitism. Doesn't mean I don't have a friendly conversation. Doesn't mean I don't try to build bridges, but that is, as we'll explore, the big lie that's come down both on the right and on the left. And as well, there's plenty other countries with land disputes, right? You go to Sudan, Congo, Western Sahara, Ukraine. Somehow none of these seem to get the attention of those that are calling for the dismantling of the Jewish state, even though there's a list of scores and scores of land disputes that you can find on the UN list and Wikipedia, et cetera. And let me just continue with a quick introduction before we get to topics in the chapter. And let me give you a little bit of my perspective. And I grew up to an Israeli family. My dad grew up in Israel, but actually experienced firsthand what we're going to talk about, which was the roots of anti-Semitism on the right and the left, right? The worst horrifying examples in the 20th century was, of course, Hitler and the Nazis, and as we'll see, Stalin and the Soviet Union. And I know Hitler and the Nazis makes my spine go crazy, but Stalin and the Soviet Union, because I was in a Habonim drawer and I lived on a kibbutz and I'm from Canada, which has great socialism, works great, somehow it doesn't make my blood curdle, but perhaps it should, and we'll explore that later. But my father grew up, we'll get to that. But I think during 1948 to 1967, the moral clarity of the situation was very obvious. I'd probably remember it like I do. It was very clear in our minds that the Arab population during World War II had actually fought with Hitler. Right? The Mufti of Jerusalem recruited a very large force that fought with Hitler against the Russians or on the Russian front, but he was trying to get them to Africa and eventually to the Middle East. But they sided with Hitler. And then once Israel was created, ethnically cleansed virtually every Arab Jew from virtually every Arab country. And so between 48 and 67, this was something very clear in our memory. There was 800,000 Arabic Jews, Jews of color, that had been fully ethnically cleansed from all these countries. Baghdad used to be 1/3 Jewish, if you can believe that. Morocco had a huge population, countries like Egypt, across the Arab world, there was an ethnic cleansing, and those were the people that constituted and still constitute the majority of the Jews of Israel. And then they tried to paint the very refugees they had displaced somehow as European colonizers. So anyone that looked at that was like, give me a break, right? That just does not add up. And then at the same time, after they had ethnically cleansed their own countries of these Jews of color, Egypt and Jordan annexed the land that had been offered to the Palestinians. This, I think, we're all familiar with. And rather than set up a Palestinian state, kept the Palestinian population in refugee camps for the next 20 years, didn't offer citizenship, and proceeded to even set up the PLO during that time to attack within Israel proper. So all the Israel as an imperialist state stuff that we heard, that as we'll see was coming out of the Arab world, the Soviet Union, we just laughed it off in that time, if you remember, because give me a break. You had just cleansed ethnic Jews. They had come to Israel as refugees, and now you hadn't even given the Palestinians a state, and you're accusing Israel of being some kind of an imperialist enemy. And then after another war of extermination, 1967, and if you remember the news and Nasser, who was making all kinds of very, very bold and upfront claims that he was going to throw the Jews in the sea, right? We think of 1967 as this war where Israel expanded and took over all these lands. Let's remember that before 1967, and this was just a few decades from the Holocaust, there were 5 armies that were going to destroy Israel, and the whole operation was basically one big war crime. One big war crime. Nasser did not say we're going to replace the leadership of Israel. He said we're going to destroy the Jews, throw them into the sea. And we see from the Arab Spring that was more recent what happens when a population is left defenseless in the Middle East. So I do believe that that was what was being threatened. And if you've been in Israel and heard about it, they actually were so terrified of the number of casualties they would have, even if they won the war, that they converted many parks into mass graveyards so they would have some place to put the bodies. That was the state of mind of Israelis when Nasser and the armies attacked. By a miracle, I would say, Israel won, Jordan, Egypt lost the territories, and now things shifted because what happened? Israel captured more territories in a war where they were defending themselves. And now, because they were ruling over the Palestinians that Egypt and Jordan had kept in refugee camps, there was an optical change, right? And there were some optics that could push forward this white colonial claim over decades, and even, as we'll see, connect it to unrelated American race issues. And we'll get into all of that. But nevertheless, it's clear to me, and I hope to those of you who followed TI for Israel, that Israel is a democratic refugee state with a majority of Jews of color who descend from Arabic Jews who've been ethnically cleansed from the surrounding countries, the very countries that are leveling this accusation of racism at us. And also for me, it's personal, as I said, because my father was born in Poland. The Nazis invaded and half of his family was murdered. He lost, in his uncle's entire family perished under the Nazis. So that was the big anti-Semitism for the right. They fled to Russia and there suffered under Stalin's anti-Jewish policies, lost another sibling, struggled through the war to survive, made it back to a refugee camp in Germany, and from there finally schlepped to Israel after Israel had been created. So I tell you personally, when I hear folks out there say that those immigrants that came to Israel were white colonial invaders of some kind, it is such a bald-faced lie to my family's experience, because I can promise you the Smolash family that schlepped from the German refugee camp with their 3 kopecks and having lost a sibling and having lost half their family, both at the hands of anti-Semitism on the right and the left, they were not colonial invaders. They did not have tanks and weapons. They did not have funds. Israel saved their lives and saved their lives from anti-Semitism, both on the right and the left, and saved it despite the concerted effort of the Arab world around that had already ethnically cleansed their Jews. So I take it a little personally when I hear these kinds of distortions. And moving on to chapters 1 and 2, let's just kind of touch on a few points that Bari Weiss made. And here we look at anti-Semitism is not something new in North America, in the USA in particular. I think you're probably more familiar than I am with Charles Coughlin. Is that how you pronounced him? Right? I mean, he was preaching from here. Apparently, I hear he had his own post office because so much mail came in to this white supremacist preacher perhaps. Henry Ford received the Grand Cross from the Nazis. Right? So again, a connection we have here. In 1939, we had 20,000 at Madison Square Garden rallying for the Nazi cause. So you'll see in Barry's book, she goes through many examples where anti-Semitism is not a new phenomenon in North America. And what happened? At some point, it seemed like there was a pause. At some point, it seemed like America was going to be a different place. Maybe it was connected to the movement of the 60s. Maybe it was a reaction to the horrors of what happened in Europe. But there were some decades where it felt like it was done, it was over, we could deal with it here in North America. And she writes, a large measure of the American Jewish freedom I've enjoyed was a reaction to what happened in those bloodlands. The post-war liberal America that rose as the Nazis fell became a fairer place to live for Jews because of the lessons of that world, and that America specifically learned only after the murder of 6 million. Unfortunately, it seems like for whatever reason, that period has started to fade. Why is a complicated question, but if you look at the FBI statistics, we now see Jews have been the targets of more racist attacks than any group in the USA since 1995. In 2020, we receive 57.5% of all the racist motivated attacks in the United States. And we are 2% of the population, just a hair over 2%. Think about that. Almost 60% of the racist attacks in North America are directed at just over 2% of the population. I think we're aware it's no better in Europe. We traveled to Israel, and there's so many French people there, and I can tell you after about the conversations with them and their warnings about where they feel it's heading in America. The UN Human Rights Council between 2006 and 16 passed 68 resolutions condemning Israel, 0 for China, 0 for Pakistan, 4 for North Korea. So it's really coming from everywhere. But although many thought that this European anti-Semitism, that we were immune in America, as Bari writes, the truth is that deeper cultural and political forces on the right and the left are transforming the country with profound implications for a group that constitutes less than 2% of the population, and those forces have made those questions thrum with increasing urgency. And then in chapter 2, Bari raises a key point, which is we often think of ourselves as a race here in North America, and perhaps post-Holocaust, we were made to be a race, and so that was imprinted on us. But if you look at the identity of the Jews throughout the ages, race is often not even there. Race is often not even there. We are a religion, we are a people, we are a civilization, we are a kingdom, a country. It was only really during the Holocaust when Hitler defined us as a race that came to be, even up anywhere in our consciousness in a serious way. But in the American conversation around racism, we've been assigned a race. That race has been white or white adjacent or white privileged. And therefore, as we'll discuss, that left us stripped of any victim identity. Crazily, although we are the poster child for the horrors of the 20th century, now we've been assigned this, white adjacent race. And so, anything we have to say about right and wrong or about anti-Semitism is somehow like meets with resistance. A second phenomenon of anti-Semitism that is really different than other racism, and this fascinates me, is that usually racists are belittling those that they're being racist towards, right? If I think so-and-so, a people is a bad people, they're beneath me, they're below me, they're unintelligent, whatever racists might think. Somehow, anti-Semitism, which really is not just racism, but more of a conspiracy theory of sorts, always tends to punch up instead of punching down, tends to punch up instead of punching down. So rather than saying the Jews are this inferior race that's dumb, that can't do things, instead we are controlling the world, we're manipulating, we're super clever, we're super smart, whatever it might be, we're wealthy. And anti-Semitism, when it's expressed as racism, is always punching up and develops into these really far-fetched conspiracy theories. In Bari's words, while racists or homophobes or misogynists see themselves as punching down, anti-Semites often perceive themselves as punching up. In the eyes of the misogynist, the woman is something less than human. In the eyes of the anti-Semite, the Jew is everything. The Jew is whatever the anti-Semite needs him to be. And here's another piece I think we're familiar with, which is the very baffling, non-rational contradictions in the claims of anti-Semites, right? That depending on who we were at that time, how we could most be identified, and depending on what that time in history saw as the biggest evil, we filled that role, even if it made no sense because two were contradictory, right? So we were always playing a part in whatever time period. In the earlier part of the Common Era, people were mainly religious communities, so we were the killers of their God. Then moving later on in history, where communism became a force, we were the capitalists, even at the same time as we were the communists to the capitalists, of course. And then, of course, with the Nazis, we became the race contaminators, even though we had never been a race. There's Jews of every color. There's Jews that come from every part of the world. We'd spread out, and we never saw ourselves as a race. You could convert to Judaism, And yet for them, we became race contaminators because that was their biggest fear. And now currently in our society, the worst thing you could be is a racist or a colonialist. So we are the racist colonialists, as baffling and irrational a claim as that could possibly be. And finally, in this chapter, she looks at something I hope you'll read more closely, which is Dara Horn's idea of Purim anti-Semitism and Hanukkah anti-Semitism. I see some faces nodding. It's a great way to think of these two categories, because what happened on Purim, Haman said, I'm going to kill the Jews. They're going to be hanged. They're going to be gone. They're different people. I want to destroy them. And everybody knew Haman was an enemy. Everybody knew Haman had to be defeated or we would be lost. Hanukkah anti-Semitism, what did they say? They said, you know what? It's fine. You can be part of our culture. You can hang out. You can be successful. Just give up that stuff that makes you Jewish, that connection to above intellect, to God, whatever it might be, those traditions. Just never mind those, and it's fine. And it seems like that anti-Semitism is less severe, but we'll discuss whether it's to be whether we should be more on guard or less on guard from the Hanukkah anti-Semitism. So with that rather lengthy introduction, let's go to, that's my style. So this is my first time teaching this class. So you'll forgive me if I underestimated the time. Let's go to anti-Semitism on the right. I think in our community, we're a Reform synagogue. We know what this looks like. I think none of us would argue with Barry's point that when I see someone doing a Heil Hitler, or as we'll learn, Jews will not replace us, or has a swastika tattooed on their arm, that, like I said, my blood curdles. I think our community reacts. We know what it is, but let's look at some of the really unfortunate recent examples. So I'm sure we all remember the Tree of Life attack, and this is the very compelling beginning of Barry's book. She's such a great writer. When you pick it up, you can't put it down, right? I mean, she's writing about such a horrible thing, and yet she pulls you in. You go through the story without being so horrified you can't read. So 11 killed, 6 wounded. Actually, the worst attack on Jews in North America. The worst attack on Jews in North America. It's crazy. In 2018. Of course, there's also Poway in California. A person walks into a Chabad center and starts shooting, and there's 1 killed and 3 wounded in 2019. The terrible Unite the Right rally in 2017, 1 killed and 35 wounded. That terrible car attack. But these are not limited to, these examples are not isolated examples, let me say. There's a credible array of examples from Timothy McVeigh, the Order in the 1980s, George Rockwell founding the American Nazi Party. Barry goes back to the Leo Frank lynching in 1915, where a fellow was accused of something and then acquitted, and he was just torn out of his jail by a mob and lynched. And after that, half of the 3,000 Jews in Georgia left the state just in horror at what had happened. So you can go through from the silver shirts in the 30s, Charles Lindbergh getting the Nazi medal, KKK bombings in the 50s. There's really never been a time when this wasn't an issue in North America. And I think we know how to identify those who are actually doing attacks. We know how to identify those that are espousing this horrible anti-Semitism that comes from Hitler, that comes from the horrible Nazism of the 20th century. I mean, they're wearing a swastika on their arm. They're shouting Heil Hitler. They're putting stuff on 4chan about, Hitler was right and the Jews need to be whatever. So all of us know how to respond. And we, I think, do even a good job of identifying and limiting those that coddle up to them or enable them in politics. I may be wrong, but I feel like we get pretty good marks as a reform community and as the URJ in fighting that. And by the way, she talks about the great replacement theory. It's one of these white supremacist theories that's floating around. If you're not familiar, these Nazis that were walking around yelling, "Jews will not replace us," they weren't talking about me replacing them. They were talking about me working with organizations to bring in people who weren't white into the country and replace the whole white population. That's the conspiracy theory where, Jews are the master organizers. the master manipulators of this race war against the white people. And so for them, although we appear white, we're the worst problems for a white supremacist, because we can sneak in, so to speak, and be part of the conversation and work with HIAS and other terrible organizations and bring in these really awful immigrants that want to work hard, that want to build the country, that want to make a great life, that are honest, amazing people. And so, you know, we are actually the tip of the spear of this replacement theory for them. So just so you know, when you hear that, that was not about us replacing them. That was about us arranging for them to be replaced. And finally, the effect of the internet. And here I think it is something that is a change in modern times. If you go back to the 20s, the 30s, the 50s, you know, if I wanted to connect horribly with the KKK or the Silver Shirts, I had to go and talk to people. I had to go to a meeting. I had to be involved. And, you know, we knew it was happening in Michigan, and it was identified. And this was something you could keep track of, at least. Now, online, we're all familiar. There's a new phenomenon where people can find like-minded people anywhere. People can really give each other ideas from anywhere. They can encourage each other from anywhere. Horrible, horrible ideas like, you know, when someone's going to make an attack on 4chan, they tell them, you know, get a high score, meaning, you know, murder as many people as you possibly can. So that really is a new phenomenon that we need to be on top of, that there's a whatever virus used to be in the body of our country, where you had to go find people to share ideas and organize. Now that can happen from anywhere, and that's a really big problem. And so wrapping up Bari's sense of what's happening on the right, she writes, there are two comforts, if it's possible to say such a thing, when it comes to right-wing anti-Semitism. The first is that it does not hide its face. It is blunt in its goals. The second is that in fighting neo-Nazis, Jews are aligned with our natural political allies, liberals. When the far right attacks us, we find sympathy and support from progressives who tend to be overwhelmingly represented in our neighborhoods and workplaces. We are the right kind of victims with the right kind of enemies. And I think most of us remember the aftermath of the Tree of Life shooting. And we had a beautiful event here where the community came together. Our young people rallied. They identified this as something terrible they needed to get personally involved in. All across the country, people were making statements that they supported Jews, that this was terrible. We responded as one. And I think we'd all agree that Hitlerian white supremacist anti-Semitism is evil, is a problem, and needs to be fought. And we work together with our allies well. So let me throw out the first question. And like I said, let's have, whether you're speaking from the Zoom or speaking here, let's make it like a 30-second comment and share your feelings. I'm curious to hear, how good a job do you feel Temple and the Reform movement have been doing fighting anti-Semitism on the right? And let's keep it for now to anti-Semitism on the right. We'll go to the left in just a moment. And let's, as I said, let's not get into debates or back and forth. I just want to hear from a few people this question. Do you feel like we've been doing a good job, a medium job, a bad job as our community and as a Reform movement fighting anti-Semitism on the right? And as I'm talking, Josh can grab the mic and just raise your hand if you're in the room and you'd like to say something. Or you can raise your hand online. Let me change my view so I can see the gallery.
Done a really good job in focusing on Israel, because I think more people know what to be proud of and what's really going on. They have better ways to answer, you know, myths or accusations.
Good. Yeah, that's one of our big hopes for this program, is that people leave with tools and that they can respond when they hear something.
The sound is not coming in very clear.
My sound
soft.
or the sound of the person asking the question?
Karen was very soft.
So the comment was, we're doing a pretty good job providing information so that when people encounter this, they can say something. But if you're asking a question, just like, you know, pull one of these on the microphone. Got someone on the side here.
Hi, I have a related thought that I kind of differ in that I don't think there's more anti-Semitism now than years ago. I think I'm comfortable now as a Jewish person to move into Grosse Pointe you couldn't say that years ago. I'm not a physician, but I heard years ago a lot of doctors couldn't practice in many hospitals. I grew up in Oak Park. There used to be a place on, I believe, Crystal Pool on 8 Mile Road. I think
Wouldn't
they
let
said-
you.
Can you folks hear that online?
Mhm.
Yeah. Yes, the comment is, and I think you're right, that in terms of everyday life and being able to be a normal functioning person in community, people don't say no Jews or anybody else allowed. We have access to everything. We can work everywhere. So certainly America has progressed in terms of our day-to-day life. I live my life without any anti-Semitic interference.
I'm wondering how much Temple has to do with helping the kids on the college campuses with the BDS and all the anti-Semitism going on at college campuses from the right.
You feel BDS is coming from the right?
I think it is partially.
Okay. Yeah, I mean,
Is that more on the left side? Is where you're going to go with that?
right now, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. To me, that's like for the second half. But
Okay.
the question of how we help kids on campuses, we're actually going to be going out over the next few weeks to several campuses, visiting, bringing them copies of Bari Weiss's book, inviting them to her event for free. So any students watching, you can come to the event itself for free, and I think also the afterglow. I may get that wrong. Also, tonight, Rabbi Later. It's tomorrow. Rabbi Later's meeting with the kids from the high school here. So definitely, whether in front or behind the scenes, I think there's a lot going on, but definitely could always be more. Let's just do one last one, then we'll
Lori Cooper here.
go ahead, Lori.
You know what went on at Bloomfield High School this last week?
Yes. Pardon me?
Talking about not being vetted, not vetting a speaker that came in to speak to our children.
Yeah, I'm very familiar. We are very engaged with that. I think Rabbi Bennett was the most engaged of any Jewish leader in the community. I'm really proud of what he's done. A lot of it you haven't necessarily heard about. I mean, you saw the letter that came out, and we're also connected with the kids. But again, I think that's kind of not within the question I'm asking now. Let's do one more. Just I'm curious to hear what people think about how we're doing with anti-Semitism on the right.
I think your question is very interesting because up until recently, I haven't felt that anti-Semitism has been a huge topic here. Temple always has such a positive outlook, and we're always looking to paint the world in such a positive way. I think trying to come at it in a positive way rather than talking about all the negative that's been happening has been the goal. So I don't want to say that Temple's done a great job telling us what to do about anti-Semitism. I think now we're jumping on and starting to handle it more.
So Sandy, if I understand right, it sounds like you're saying temples tend to be like, yay, Judaism, yay, America, things are good, yay, community, and shy away from, really like putting the gloves on and saying like, hold on, you can't treat us that way. And you feel like perhaps these programs are stepping more in that direction, I'm understanding? Good. I think great information for us to have. And if you'd like to post in the comments on Facebook, we'd love to hear your thoughts as well for Temple members and those in our community. Okay, one more.
I don't know, maybe I'm naive, but I didn't feel anti-Semitism as I was growing up to the extent that I feel it now, and I'm concerned for our children in a different sense. I think it's gotten blatant. Maybe it was always there, but it's blatantly in your face now, where in the past, it's kind of been, we don't talk about it. We just talk about it at our kitchen tables and keep our mouth closed. And now they brag about it.
Yeah, so we'll move on, but I do think both these reactions have truth. I think on the one hand, I can go to any college, my kids can go to any college. There's no limits. I can be a member of any club. I can live anywhere. So in my life and in our lives, we have total freedom without anti-Semitic restraints. On the other hand, I think because perhaps part of it is the internet, part of it is a certain culture and other things, anti-Semites on the right have been emboldened. And there's not a sense of like, I got to kind of keep this, in the backyard and like not be too public about it. Like really, they create communities and you feel like it's more unapologetic and more public in some ways. So I think both are true. I think both are true. So let's move on to now chapter 4, which is anti-Semitism on the left. And here I do think I've had a certain blind spot. And I think the progressive Jewish communities had a certain blind spot. And certainly progressive movements like the URJ or Young Jews have started to feel ambiguous about Israel. And often you'll hear people say, you know, when people say that they're anti-Zionist, you really want to have a nuanced conversation with them. There's two sides to the issue. You know, there's really the Palestinian narrative, really, that's a valid narrative, and we need to hear each other. And honestly, I'm not sure that that's the case. Sometimes I think the answer is clarity, not nuance. Certainly when we're having dialogue about how to solve things, there we want nuance. There we want to have good relationships. We want to work to create relationships and creative solutions. But in terms of the question, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? I just don't think that there is nuance there. I think looking back at, like I said, ethnic Arabic Jews that were ethnically cleansed from Arab lands, looking back at the refugees that came to Israel, looking back at the Arab wars against Israel, looking at Israel's society, and looking at this concerted effort for its entire existence to dismantle it from the very beginning, I think it needs to be clear in our minds, and Barry makes the point very eloquently, that someone that says only the Jewish state needs to be dismantled, that is anti-Semitism, and it's not nuanced, right? The solutions may be nuanced, the relationships definitely need to be nuanced, but I think at least for us in our minds, I'd like us to consider that it's pretty black and white when someone says only the Jewish state should somehow end, and all these Jews should somehow pick up and go back where the 800,000 Jews that came from Arab lands will go back to the Arab lands. Like my family would go back to Poland. You know, people. Anyways, I won't go on, but let's look at some of the events that have happened recently coming from the left. Right. So, of course, the Jersey shooting in 2019, 3 were killed. I don't want to say, thank God it was only 3, but they actually were targeting a children's school next door and weren't able to get in. So that may have been far more tragic than it was with just shooting a supermarket. As well, the Muncie Hanukkah stabbing, also not coming from a white supremacist. There, 1 was killed and 4 were wounded. Imagine being in a Hanukkah celebration and someone comes in with a machete and starts swinging. That is not something I'd ever want to experience. And you mentioned BDS. To me, BDS seems to have more of a partnership with the left. I don't know of a lot of right wing. You know, there's a few like fringe Jewish groups that are kind of connected to it, but other than that, and for those that feel like BDS really is just targeting Israeli policies that need to be changed and is a strategy for just shifting and making life easier for Palestinians. I think that's a very enticing way to look at it, but it certainly is not the point of view of Omar Barghouti, who founded the BDS movement. And by the way, any quote that you hear, I vetted. I actually saw the video of him saying this, and it was up before deep fakes were a thing. And he said, definitely, most definitely, we oppose a Jewish state in any part of Palestine. No Palestinian, rational Palestinian, not a sellout Palestinian, will ever accept a Jewish state in Palestine, right? Will ever accept a Jewish state in Palestine anywhere. So this is the founder of the BDS movement. And if you watch the talks and you watch and you read what's being written in the movement, it really is a movement to undermine the existence of the state of Israel, not just to change the policies of the state of Israel. Were it otherwise, I would feel differently. And finally, we look at reports from the ADL that I mentioned. Assaults considered the most serious incident type because it involves person-on-person physical violence. These are people being hit in the face with bricks, being beaten, being chased, being stomped on the street. So this is not somebody just, shouting something inappropriate in school, which is also bad. But person-on-person physical violence triggered by anti-Semitic animus increased 167%, jumping to a total of 88 reports in 2021 from 33 in 2020. Incidents of harassment were up 43%, and acts of vandalism rose 14%. And I'd like to just take a second and share a list of one period, and I think it was 2021. From Wikipedia, this is a list of anti-Semitic attacks over 10 days. This is May 18th to May 27th, 2021. And here, the majority of these attacks, the ADL and the FBI show, happen, unfortunately, in blue areas of the country, right? In Brooklyn and other places where there's not a lot of white supremacists walking around, and we have videos. So, I mean, the sad truth about these is the majority of these are young men, either of African American descent or of Arabic American descent. And it's being targeted mainly at people that are visibly Jewish, right? And somehow we kind of turn a blind eye to this a little. I don't see a lot of outrage from the URJ, from Temple Israel, at this plague, this epidemic of just person-on-person attacks that's happened. And so here's these 10 days. Swastikas spray painted in a Holocaust museum. 67-year-old man punched in the face as he tried to enter a synagogue in Brooklyn. 3 men tried to break into a synagogue, assaulted 2 Jewish teens, choking one, punching the other in the head, chasing them for blocks with cricket bats. That's in Brooklyn. Anti-Semitic threats yelled at a rabbi in front of a synagogue, came back and dumped a bag of human feces in front of the building. You probably remember that crazy day in the Diamond District where a caravan of cars and trucks with flags were shooting fireworks at people and yelling, "F you Zionists, F you pigs." The same day in Times Square, 5 or 6 men punched, kicked, bludgeoned, hit with a crutch, and maced and pepper sprayed a visibly Jewish man. He was hospitalized with a concussion. The day before, a Brooklyn man attempted to set fire to a building that housed a synagogue, punched a visibly Jewish man in the head several times. A Jewish man was assaulted. 4 men threw garbage at them and threatened to rape the mother of the family. It was a family walking. 2 cars with Palestinian flags yelling Allahu Akbar chased down and tried to run over a Jewish man. So very serious attacks, right? And this is not an isolated week. These attacks have been going on for several years. In New York, they know this is just part of life. And somehow I feel like there's more outrage from at least the Reform community around white supremacists primarily doing stuff than these. I just wanted to bring it to our attention. I think one of the issues is American Jews have an affinity for the left. And so it's a lot easier to just spot anti-Semitism to the right. And Bari really sums it up eloquently, of course, herself, where she says, the problem with this assumed accord between liberal politics and Jews is that it blinds us into thinking that anti-Semitism is only a problem of the right, a fantasy that falls apart under the gentlest scrutiny. Just as there is modern anti-Semitism that traces back to Hitler, there is also modern anti-Semitism that begins with Lenin and intensifies under Stalin. And if you're watching and you're kind of having your tea and not paying attention, this, I think, is the most important point that Bari makes in her book. I think the most important point she makes in her book, and that is, yeah?
Do you think there's really any connection between those thugs in Brooklyn and either Stalin or Hitler?
Well, that's the point that I'm getting into. Yeah. The question was a rather incredulous statement. And I think this actually illustrates, yeah. Pardon me?
I think it's an absurd statement.
Yeah. So this is, I think, the reaction many of us have. Like, what on earth does Stalin have to do with anything happening in New York? No connection whatsoever. That's an historical figure. And people in New York, they're just doing what they do, right? No connection whatsoever. I think if you read her book, it may cause you to rethink that statement. And I think the power and the sense that, of course, there's no connection speaks to really perhaps why it is that we don't connect the dots in this. So let me wade in, and maybe you'll disagree, right? So let me just put her ideas on the table. And certainly, I think just looking at the pictures on the screen, every Jewish person will recognize the fellow on the left, right? A demon that, his name should be erased from history. What percentage of living Jews do you think could identify the person on the right? Every age. Alex, do you know who he is?
Yes, of course.
You do?
Yes, that's Joseph Stalin.
Oh, nice. Good, yeah. Right. So my kids, I don't think know there's been Lenin and Stalin. They studied Animal Farm, but so that the question is, why is Stalin not seen as bad as Hitler? Right. The body count was higher for Stalin. Right. I mean, historians say he killed as many as 20 million people. 20 million people, right? And terrible, terrible for the Jews. My family suffered under it, right? Lost a sibling because of it. And he would, one of his purges, actually, they executed 700,000 people in one of his purges, right? He completely decimated the Jewish population, was equally as bad. And as we'll see, there's a form of anti-Semitism that stems from Leninist and Stalinist Russia and extends through the 70s and even the 80s. And the point Barry makes in the book, which I think many of us may miss, is that the kind of anti-Semitism we're seeing on the left has inherited the imagery, the ideas, and the philosophy of Stalin and that propaganda as directly as a white supremacist has inherited anti-Semitism from Hitler, right? So I know this is a tough leap to make. And I certainly, as I said, grew up in Habonim Dror. I got a soft spot for kibbutzim. Soviet imagery was like a kind of these kooky, Soviet propaganda in the 70s. Who could take it seriously? And, socialism isn't that bad. So somehow the sickle and hammer does not strike me and make my blood curdle, as I said, as the swastika does. And Barry's point is perhaps it should. And let's look at the connections between Stalin's propaganda that went through the 70s and the propaganda we're seeing now, and how perhaps it was imported from the Arab population that it was directed at in many ways. Yeah.
There are obviously, as Stalin was a criminal and a communist, why is it that maybe there's an answer, I don't know. Why is it there are so many Jews historically that came out of communism? We're communists.
Yeah. Well, so this is not a point.
Defense mechanism?
Yeah. So the question was, that's a good question. Why are there so many Jews that were involved in the Communist Party, that supported the Communist Party? I don't want to go deep into it. I didn't prepare to. What's that?
We have another question for you as well.
Okay. Well, let's wait till the discussion period. I want to address this quickly, but this could quickly become a 4-hour discussion and back and forth. I don't put myself as an expert on Barry's level by any stretch. I've been doing this education since I was a kid and helping him George, so I'm familiar. But I don't think there's a point to doing a question answer with me. I'm just presenting the stuff from her book. But a point she makes in her book is, why is it that on the left, it's a common phenomenon to have parts of the Jewish community or parts of the community being persecuted actively cooperating with that organization? And we see with Stalin, he had what was it called, Yevseksia or something, I don't pronounce it, but the Jewish committee was often even worse for the Jewish population than the rest of the Communist Party, because they had to prove that they were true communists, right? And unfortunately, as you see historically, they usually were devoured themselves. Everyone on that committee was eventually also executed or sent to Siberia. But the point she makes, and if you read the book, I think she makes it really thoroughly, is one of the phenomenons of anti-Semitism on the left and Stalinist anti-Semitism is that there is always part of the Jewish community that buys into it, and that buys into it whole hog, and that eventually, historically, gets destroyed by it as well. So I think that's the case today. You'll see you'll see very vocal, a minority of the Jewish community, but very vocally say, yes, Israel is a terrible country that should be dismantled. I am an anti-Zionist. And Barry's point is that shouldn't confuse us, because it is yet another hallmark of how anti-Semitism presents on the left, and it's always been. Right, but I don't have quotes from her. That's just a quick answer to your question. I don't have to go any further into why Stalin was bad for the Jews. I think we know Stalin was bad, and perhaps as bad or worse than Hitler. Certainly, on that level. And there was a great propaganda campaign against the Jews in Russia once Israel was established. And you're probably thinking, if Russia voted for the establishment of Israel, then how could they be so bad? Well, at the time, Stalin believed that Israel was going to be another socialist state. And so that's understood politically why he abstained, at least in the UN vote. But immediately after he saw that it wasn't going to, a propaganda campaign began, really targeting the Jewish state as being an imperialist state. And when you look at the imagery that was used, it's I would say like a disgusting blend of classical anti-Semitic imagery of the Jew as a a spider or a dog or a snake, but now combined with all kinds of other imagery, comparing the Jew to, even as we'll see, Nazis themselves, the Jew as, you know, the world dominator nationally instead of just behind the scenes with banks. And as it became clear that Israel was there to stay, that grew and grew and really accelerated after 1967, when the Arab countries that were Soviet, what's the term, client states, so to speak, lost the 67 war in a very embarrassing fashion. And so now this propaganda was directed very intensely at the Arab world to prop them up, to undermine US interests in the Middle East, to forward Russian interests in the Middle East. And when you look at scholars that are studying it, they see thousands and thousands of articles that were put out, hundreds and hundreds of books that were put out with this anti-Semitic tone, and 1,000 hours a week of propaganda was put over the radio. And it was directed not just to Russia and the Jews of Russia, but directed to Asia, to Africa, and in particular to the Arab countries in the Middle East. And in many ways, that was the world they lived in. They lived in a world where, even though they had just attacked Israel, Israel was the imperialist aggressor. And even though the Jews had been, you know, almost wiped out by Hitler, now the Jews somehow were Hitler. And that was a thing that could only make sense in this bizarre world of Soviet propaganda, right? I remember seeing it kind of in the periphery and thinking, like, who could take that seriously? And the unfortunate reality is, as Barry points out, as the Palestinian cause has moved into American circles, those same anti-Semitic ideas have now been imported and even connected with American racial ideas. So I can't read you 1,000 hours of propaganda, but I think a picture speaks 1,000 words. So I'm going to share with you a series of, let's call them cartoons, that are, and a picture from the Soviet era. And imagine not just these parades, not just these pictures, but articles and books and radio propaganda and people speaking about this and creating a whole culture where your whole raison d'etre was to work against this horrible enemy that's being portrayed. So here is in the 1970s, a Soviet parade. Of course, you see the spider with the Jewish hat. It's got the big Jewish nose. It's got the pointy teeth. And then there's the iron web that it's spreading presumably over the world. And that slogan says, Zionism is the weapon of imperialism. And you got these happy children riding on that float in the Soviet Union. Here's a favorite image in, now it's whatever, Khrushchev or whoever's running the Soviet Union at this point, a Zionist cobweb spider at his favorite work. And it says Zionist on his back. There's the Star of David in the middle. And then all the Russian cobweb strands are, various conspiracy theories of how the Jews are controlling the money and the nations, etc. The protocols of the Elders of Zion, we kind of heard it was put out by Russia. It was translated into 80 languages, sent all around the world. And this really, when you hear about anti-Semites on the left quoting the protocols of the Elders of Zion, this isn't, I used to think this is just these crackpots that found this thing online and they're like, oh, I love this. But really, this was the foundational thinking of the anti-Zionist sentiment in the Arab world for decades and decades. And now, as that cause has moved into European and American spaces, unfortunately, we haven't identified that this original anti-Semitism, which should alarm us as much as the swastika, has also been adopted, right? When I see a white supremacist doing a Heil Hitler, I know where it came from. When I see someone, waving the protocols of the Elders of Zion around, it's kind of funny and silly. We know it's not true, but we don't recognize the seriousness. This came from a propaganda campaign from a leader responsible for the death of 20 million and was projected over decades in the Arab world and in Africa. And then I think perhaps the sickest and most nonsensical attempt, somehow though it succeeded, because propaganda does not work with the rational mind, was to actually portray, and this is in 1970, 3 years after 67, 3 years after the Arab armies literally said, we're going to throw the Jews into the sea. The Arabs who, again, as I said, sided with Hitler, fought with Hitler, in 67, 3 years earlier, we're going to fulfill the Grand Mufti's vision of finishing what Hitler started and wiping out the remainder of the Jews. And now Russian propaganda is equating a Jewish soldier with a Nazi soldier. I don't know if you can call it a sleight of hand. It seems like a bludgeon over the head, but this is perhaps the most insidious. And again, when you see modern left-wing anti-Zionists saying that Israelis are Nazis, that's not some crazy claim that they just dreamed up. It's not just that it's the worst thing they could think of and they're trying to make us angry or get a point across. That is as much in the tradition of this Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda as the white supremacist that says, we're polluting the master race and we're going to replace them or something like that. And another example, this one's really a work of art here. You see all the detail that went into it. You've got the Jewish, I don't know if it's just a farmer or who he is. He's got an axe dripping blood with him again, David. I'm not sure what that strange hairpiece is, and a swastika in his eyes. And in the back, his shadow is that of Hitler, and the Star of David converted into a swastika. And this really, I think, again, this is her most important point, and we should really take this in. Anti-Zionism on the left has inherited this as much as anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism on the right has inherited the swastika. And perhaps to make that home, here's another cartoon not from the 70s. I don't know if does anyone recognize where this is from? No, not the New Yorker. This is 2016 Tehran's Holocaust cartoon contest. So, the anti-Zionist world is still putting this stuff out, and this is published, and this is, a great work of art to them. And someone mentioned the New Yorker, we saw this picture, here is something where, you see this appear in New York Times in 2019, and we somehow can't identify that this is as anti-Semitic and inappropriate as putting some Hitlerian Jewish caricature up, right? A Jew as a dog, a Jew as the manipulator, blindly leading the forces of the West to do whatever they want. Like, it takes so many of the dehumanizing images that were there in Soviet propaganda, and we just without thinking put it up in the New York Times. There definitely was an outcry, but my thesis, and I really feel this is important to take home, is that we need to start seriously looking at these images and where they came from. And I think the left needs to do some soul searching about where their philosophy comes from, where their thinking comes from, where their imagery comes from, where their emotion comes from, and take seriously that they've inherited from as big a mass murderer as Hitler, who did this very knowingly and very effectively. 2019, I don't remember which scandal or which it was, probably during the election, maybe it was I don't remember, 2019. It doesn't matter to me, right? Yeah. I know we naturally think, well, what happened? What did Bibi do to deserve this? Isn't he a strong man? Isn't he a bad guy? One point I heard Bari make when she did an interview with what's his name? Jewish, very famous TV, forgetting his name, but Jake Tapper. The 90s. You see the New York Wise interview? Brilliant interview. And he asked her, well, look at the government in Israel. Doesn't that somehow explain anti-Semitism, right? Doesn't that somehow explain anti-Semitism? And her answer was perfect. She said, you know what, Jake? I don't agree with the government in Israel. They do a lot wrong. There's a lot wrong with Israel, just like every country. But the Jews are never responsible for anti-Semitism. The Jews are never responsible for anti-Semitism, right? So that picture should just never happen, right? The same way we know, German Nazi imagery should never happen. That picture, in my mind, should also never happen. And let's move in the last few minutes to the effects of this, which is, in my mind, exclusion, and it ties into the intersectionality piece, which I want to at least touch on, right? And here we're in chapter 4 of her book. You can read about a lot of examples, and I think Barry's the kind of person. She says she goes to a town, and after she finishes her talk, a lot of people come up and they say, you know what, I haven't talked to anyone about this, but I support Israel, but I can't talk about it at work, or I can't talk about it with my family or my friends, or I'm at school and, I have to write this essay and say this to pass a class, but, really I believe this. And they come up and it's like they're confessing to her that they're Zionists, but there's this pressure that they can't even talk about it, let alone push back against anti-Zionist rhetoric that they run into, whether it's in work, friends, family. And she writes in her book, why are these Jews hiding? More specifically, why are they hiding in progressive circles in which they live and work and protest and date and marry and parent? In the circles hyper obsessed with embracing authenticity, in the circles that promise preferred pronoun usage. I don't know how many people here have felt this. I'll tell you, my kids, we saw what happened in the high school lately. I don't want to get deep into it, but what was happening in the colleges seems to be now landing on our kids in the high school. They don't have the tools to deal with it. There's kids on both sides that got angry and acted inappropriately, and we need to wade in. But my kids say you can absolutely not talk about Israel at school, period, ever. End of story, right? It's not that they don't have the tools. It's not that they don't feel strongly enough about it. It's that there is such a social pressure to not bring it up. Why? Because now we've actually adopted this idea that Zionism is as bad as racism, is as bad as apartheid, is as bad as genocide, and it just comes in a package, and anybody that brings it up is going to be immediately ostracized. And I think a lot of us feel the same thing too organizationally. We're here, we often see things that we think are troubling, but we also want to work, of course, on racism with organizations like Black Lives Matter. We want to work on issues like sexism with the Women's March. We want to work on issues of gay rights with the Dyke March. So is it really going to be handy for me to kind of say, this anti-Semitism that you have in your leadership and your organization, you really need to take it seriously? I know a lot of people, a lot of organizations that kind of shy away from that. Because progressivism is asking us to make a choice. Do we side with the racists or the victims? Are we part of the coalition of the oppressed or the coalition of the oppressors? And there's lots of examples in Barry's book, from the Dyke March to Rashida Tlaib saying more recently, I want you all to know that among progressives, it becomes clear that you cannot claim to hold progressive values, yet back Israel's apartheid government, right? And again, I saw a video of her saying that. This is not just something from Twitter, right? This is what she said. Among progressives, you cannot claim to hold progressive values, yet back Israel's apartheid government. So here I am. I'm on a student campus. I'm in a Jewish organization. I want to work with my allies on this. And here they're saying, you know what? You better be anti-Israel because they're apartheid. And you're by definition not progressive unless you show us you're anti-Israel. And so what do? We show up without our whole identity. Even though, strangely, this is a community that says, whatever your identity is, we embrace it. We honor everybody's identity. Somehow, Judaism has been whitewashed out of that conversation. It's worthwhile to pause and consider the breathtaking twist of history here. Once anti-Semitism required Jews to publicly mark themselves, now in some of the precincts of progressivism, anti-Semitism requires them not to. This, of course, is from the Dyke March, where some gay women showed up with a beautiful rainbow flag with the Star of David. It's a wonderful symbol embracing their whole identity, who they are, enthusiastically supporting the Dyke March. And the leadership told them they could not come with that, whatever they call it, an imperious symbol that made people feel unsafe. The Star of David, that's been a Jewish symbol since the 3rd century. And again, Jews are welcomed so long as they undertake a kind of secular conversion by disavowing many or most of the things that actually make them Jewish. Whereas Jews once had to convert to Christianity, now they have to convert to anti-Zionism. So I'd like to hear a little. We're going to go over a little, and I apologize for that, but I could finish up, but I want to hear a little. I had some skepticism, and probably not the only person in the room that was skeptical. Hearing this, do your feelings remain exactly the same? Do you feel like this is far-fetched? Does this shift a little? Like, how do people feel? My question would be, to what extent do you feel anti-Semitism on the left is an extension of the Soviet era propaganda I've described? Or maybe it's just hogwash in your mind. Maybe this is just a crazy thing.
Well, I don't think it's from Soviet propaganda. Just like your kids, don't know the difference between Hitler and Stalin. I think the kid, essentially the kids beating up Jewish kids or Jewish adults in Brooklyn couldn't tell you who Stalin was, most of them.
Okay. And again, let's not make it a debate. I want to hear from lots of people. So there you go. Yeah, let's pass it around.
Just to add to that, I think many bigots and racists don't know where their feelings came from. They were taught in their homes and they were taught in their, I mean, it just comes. I don't know that they have to know that it was Stalin, but that's what they were taught.
Yeah. So, I mean, let me just touch on that. I'm not saying that a pro-Palestinian activist on a campus who, uses some of this imagery understands, they say, I like Stalin. I'm a fan of Stalin. I'm going to do this the way a white supremacist will identify Hitler and say, I love Hitler. So I agree that they're not aware where this came from. But where I am convinced is that it's a direct line that created the whole culture of anti-Zionism in the Arab world, and that explains some of the strange language, why they're calling Israel Nazis. So no, I don't think they're aware that, they have inherited. I think it would help if they would, because they probably should think twice about it. But let's hear from some more.
I agree that I think that it goes back to lack of knowledge being the greatest criminal. And when you talk about the incidents in New York and the obvious Jews being attacked, I think that the fact that tends to be that it's orthodoxy and that they're Orthodox Jews, because those are the ones who are most recognizable, leaves the rest of us kind of guilty because we kind of look the other way because it's just not us.
Yep, I think it's a part of it. I don't want to get involved. It's sort of like someone else's a little bit.
I think that even relates to what happened in Bloomfield Hills, because there wasn't an understanding that the anti-Israel propaganda was actually anti-Semitism as well.
Yeah, that is 100% the disconnect. So if you talk to somebody from that side and you say, hey, what you're doing is anti-Semitism, they'll come back and they'll say, as they did in high school, this is my identity. You're limiting my ability to express myself. Yeah, I get that.
That's where I think that we can do better and start to do better is some of the language that children, even us as adults, need to know. When does anti-Zionism cross into anti-Semitism? So we all know, criticizing the government policies, these sorts of things as Israel, okay. But when that woman at Bloomfield Hills called Israel Palestine, that means a non-existent state of Israel, which means a non-existent, for the Jews. And kids don't understand that. Some of the adults don't understand it. So I think if we can start with a better understanding of what these words are, so that kids know when they're feeling uncomfortable and why, and is it rational or not. Nobody really cares when the Jews are uncomfortable. Everybody else in every other group, we make them uncomfortable. And I know right now what I'm saying is uncomfortable to hear. But when the Jews are uncomfortable, nobody seems to care. And so we need to really stand up and hold people accountable, because now, like you had just said, it's trickled down now into the high school. Where's it going after that? And I know that Bloomfield Hills is really trying to rectify things, and I honor them for doing that. And so we need to hold people accountable, and we need to educate ourselves as well as our children.
Great, yeah, and it's can be a little confusing, because when someone says the Palestinians deserve a country, yeah, absolutely, I agree. Everyone deserves a country, but when that slides into, that means the Jews cannot have a country. Now, that to me, I agree, is clearly anti-Semitic, and I'm okay making anyone feel uncomfortable by expressing and being clear about that. I want to start wrapping up because it's becoming late night, but thanks to everybody. There's a lot more I wanted to get into, but we're just going to skip to the very last point. And that is, I'll say, I grew up in Canada. Politics is pretty different there. And politics is pretty different when I moved here. And I think it's changed a lot in the last 20 years. And I think going back 20, 30, 40 years, many of us would agree that although we had differences in the Jewish community, in the left and the right, we worked together to make sure the political conversation was united around Israel. We worked together to make sure Israel was a bipartisan issue. Today, it feels more and more like we know American politics has become something of a circus, And rather than us uniting politics around Israel, politics is dividing the Jewish community around Israel. And I fear if it keeps going, the sort of circus of American politics, Israel will become just another sort of horrible, clown act in that, and support for Israel can really become a problem here. So my suggestion from inside one of the largest Reform synagogues in the world, I feel like it takes more than just us working together as a community. I feel like what it takes is we have to understand that we're only effective if we're actually responsible for our organizations on our side of the aisle. Because if I start yelling at some very, very right-wing organization that I would never support or vote for, I'm probably going to exaggerate because, I'm not really a friend of that organization. They're going to see through that. It's not going to be effective. We don't have a relationship, and it's really not going to help. And vice versa, if someone on the other side yells at my organization, easily dismissed, they're probably not going to be accurate. And that is how we divide our community and have zero influence and effect to help create bipartisan support for Israel and make sure people understand whatever policies you disagree with, and everyone does deeply in many cases, that the existence of the state of Israel needs to be a bipartisan issue, and that anti-Zionism cannot have a place in American politics in terms of destroying the one Jewish state in the world. And so to do that, good luck, right? And so to do that, I think what we need to start doing is each of us really approaching our own organizations. And so for us, that's the URJ. I would say that's the ADL. You can name the organizations. Perhaps for Orthodox communities, it's other organizations on their side. We need to each take responsibility and make sure that people we're close with are not stepping out of line, understand when they've crossed that line, and change in as much as they can to make sure they move away from allowing the virus of anti-Semitism into their organizations. So, I'm asking anyone who's watching, who's, participating in the Jewish community, participating in politics, to think about that, because all we seem to hear is people yelling at the other side. And I think we all agree that that never has any influence, never has any impact. So I hope that we'll start working together as a Jewish community. I hope that you will definitely come to Rabbi Josh's class, April 13th at 7 p.m. when he talks about now what comes next, what can we do, action. And of course, May 4th, we'll see you all as we host the amazing Bari Weiss along with our beloved Mitch Album here at Temple Israel. We're going to finish the Zoom now. I'm going to hang out and discuss, have any questions. If we want to get into it, we can pour some scotch and be here for the next 3 hours. But the formal class is over. Thanks, everybody. It's been beautiful. And we'll see you at our next event.